Fantastic. So, welcome everyone to this webinar on enterprise intelligence from the K&IM Special Interest Group at CILIP. I am really delighted to welcome along Gabriel and Andrew, who are going to be presenting today. So Gabriel is an entrepreneur, an author and a management consultant within the fields of information management, knowledge management and enterprise intelligence. And he's been working with clients on all these topics all over Europe, North America and Asia. He has a BA degree in physics, interesting, from Lund University, Sweden, as well as an MBA from the London Business School. He's also former director of, group director of competitive intelligence at telecommunications vendor Ericsson, as well as co-founder and long-term board and management team member of intelligence and K&IM software vendor from Intelli. His publications include Gardens of Intelligence and some articles in the CIP magazine, as well as a range of web published papers on information theory. So very interesting. Andrew is a director of competitive intelligence and insights at Novartis, focused on supporting the company's R&D portfolio. See, I think this is so interesting. People come from different backgrounds. Andrew's originally a chemist by training, and after his PhD, began a career as a patent and IP analyst at Thomson Reuters before joining Novartis in 2004. At Novartis, Andrew's worked in a variety of roles, all focused in some way around knowledge management, information analysis, and competitive intelligence. He's a passion particularly for knowledge management and process efficiency, as well as building streamlined communities of practice. Andrew is the current chairman for Pharma CI Europe conference and also holds a position on the board of directors of Pharmaceutical and Medtech Information non-profit organisation. So welcome, Gabriel and Andrew. I will now hand over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Helen. I'll kick off by just saying that the background to this webinar is that I wrote a piece earlier this year that based on some thoughts I have, things we've seen in a large number of organizations, which is, that this whole situation with individuals out there in the line organization, specialists or whatever, that knows tons of things, but whose sort of insights are rarely really taken care of in the intelligence processes or the sort of insights work of the organization. So that turned out to be a paper. You can find that on my website or at LinkedIn. What happened was that Andrew, long-term good business friend and collaborator, picked up this paper and said, well, hang on a minute, can I use this as a background for a case that I'm intending to present at Pharma CI in Rome this year? So we had a chat about that, and so of course, absolutely, go for it. And the feedback on that was really good. So Andrew and I decided to, why don't we make a webinar out of this as well? So what you see on the screen right now is really a summary of where does this come from, where we talk about those lone wolves of intelligence, as we label them. They're a resource, key resource of any intelligence operation, in its internal as well as external network of these subject matter experts. They possess a high level of expertise in very specific fields. They're all out there. They could be engineers, they could be marketing people, they could be financial people, everywhere in the organization, but they're really specialized. All these SMEs are vital for a successful intelligence operation, but we still call them the lone wolves because we rarely include them as we should in the operations. You can read the rest without me talking, but the whole thing is that we need to embrace the principles of communities of practice in order to really get this expertise into our insights apparatus. So that's really the background. You can read the paper online. So then I really like to bounce over to Andrew and say, okay, you saw the paper. What was it that made you sort of connect the dots to your own organization and sort of take it from there?
Yeah, thanks, Gabriel. So yeah, I think there's a lot of what I was reading in the paper. It really struck a chord straight away. I could clearly identify this was the sort of experience I've had at Novartis over a number of years. There's a lot of frustration, maybe, yet also a large amount of sort of passion and a great vision that we had to offer enterprise intelligence to the whole company. And maybe I should quickly pause and say, in case you don't know, so Novartis is one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world. That means it's a huge organization, global, and with a lot of moving parts. So as you'll discover as we go through this, obviously that just makes things trickier and trickier to manage. So really that was the impetus for me in reaching out again to Gabriel, was reading this. It's like, yeah, you're almost describing my organization and my experience to a T. I fully agree with basically everything that's being said. So I thought, well, maybe try and give some flavor around, sort of case studies and things that we've done in our company as we've begun this journey towards enterprise intelligence. And thought I'd start off as a lover of Lego. I'm sorry, it's a bit childish, but I like to give a few personalities. And I wanted to start introducing this concept of lone wolves as they might exist in my company. So the top guy, he's been doing oncology. This is Peter. He's been here a long time, almost as long as me. Knows everything about what's going on in the oncology marketplace, so on and so forth. And he knows exactly what's coming next on this massive landscape. Then you got another guy, another lone wolf, who's Raj, and he works in neuroscience, and he's really interested in early research. And he's on top of everything with his R&D stakeholders, the scientists, the project leads, and they love that because he keeps them up to date with everything they could possibly want. They get all the information being fed to them. They find it super useful, and as part of his passion for his job, he's also doing cool things with like visualizations and representing data in different ways. And then at the bottom we've got Sarah. Now she's not specifically working in CI, but she's heading up portfolio analytics. And she does an awful lot of benchmarking of our own company's activities versus our peers out there, and generally knows that whole landscape really well. So what we've got here are three true experts, really know what's going on in their field. But this is the problem, are these people actually talking to each other? And it's rarely, if not at all. And kind of why should they? They don't really have that overlap for the domains of expertise. And, why would they talk to other people in other units when they're kept so busy with their regular role? So Gabriel sort of came to this conclusion: if you've got all of these experts everywhere, these lone wolves, they're acting on their own almost. And it's not really an intelligence operation per se, because they're disconnected to other people within that sort of outside of their immediate network, outside of their immediate sphere of interest. And then what if we've got one of these people supporting every single function in every geographical location, all doing a fantastic job? It's still not an intelligent operation, simply because we're not working that efficiently and we're in these sort of knowledge silos. And that's really what the paper was proposing, is to try and evolve this approach where we know we've got the expertise, but can we connect it, and can we create a cross-disciplinary intelligence function and capability that better supports the organization?
Which of course is the challenge. And we discussed a little bit about, how addressing the problem that we're seeing here. I mean, essentially, if the problem is so obvious, which essentially everyone you talk to, whatever company, why does it happen, and how can we sort of improve things? And the big question is, of course, why are we working like this? What's the problem? And the response is very often, my boss has asked me to keep track of this. But the problem is Peter's mandate in that case linked to an overall corporate strategy? No, because he's constantly just responding to very specific questions. So it's constrained to specific problems for a very select group of people. And as long as Peter continues to do an excellent job tracking his job, his stakeholders, management, will be perfectly happy. And at that local site, that is very often perceived as being more than sufficient. I can assure you, those who haven't been in the intelligence operations or profession, this is a recurring frustration among intelligence professionals to try to secure budgets and resources for a more structured intelligence approach. Because when you shall involve these individuals, it does require resources and sometimes actually budgets to have supporting tools, etc., in place. We'll come back to that a little bit later, but we are in a very siloed situation here. And we need to do something about that, break up the silos, essentially. So next slide is how do you avoid the knowledge silos? And Andrew, I think you had some thought here, yeah?
Exactly. So it's inevitable. And hopefully the previous slide kind of gives you that fairly obvious introduction into this. It's going to be very difficult to not have these, pockets of people working independently of each other with their own mandates. So that means that their information is not being shared across different groups, and it could be different groups within the organization, say within that exact same therapy area, but maybe a different stage of the R&D pipeline. It could be early research versus marketed brands in that therapy. And the larger the organization, the more complex this gets. So we know it's going to happen, and we know it's very, very difficult to prevent. The trouble with these knowledge silos is it brings a huge amount of inefficiency. And there was a nice survey done a couple of years ago in the US that the average knowledge worker spends about 2 hours a week just recreating or duplicating information that was already there, and again another sort of almost 2 hours a week repeating the answers that have already been given, or resharing the same thing to the same people. And when I presented this in Rome, that's where I saw people sitting up and taking notice. But I also said that I think for certainly in my situation with a lot of the CI group that I'm sort of managing, you could easily double the amount of extra work that's going on in our CI organization, with the duplication of effort. And obviously that's not a great way to carry out business, if you're needing twice as many people, or you're spending way too long on every single task. And the other point I think to note about the silos is, we don't mean to have these silos, generally speaking. There are occasions where people will hoard information and not be willing to share. That's not sort of the overall approach our company would ever recommend. But generally, people aren't intentionally withholding this useful, valuable information. It's either they're not thinking about it, or they don't know what to share, whether they can share. They don't know how they can bring knowledge together. They don't know how to make it available. And, sometimes they're just so overwhelmed that, they haven't got time to do it. And as we said in a couple of slides previous, they tend to be driven by their own mandate. So as long as they're doing their job, keeping their manager happy, keeping their stakeholders happy, there isn't an obvious problem. But hopefully we're sort of slowly peeling back the layers here, and you're kind of starting to see that there are some clear advantages we could have if we start working with a more enterprise mindset.
Andrew, a question on the unintentional box there. One thing that I've encountered many times talking to people that we would sort of label as the lone wolves in organizations is that even if they know that they're sitting on something that is really interesting, that could have a value somewhere, they really don't know where to share it, not just make it available online or something, but I mean, who to call. Who can I share this with now, because it might be actually some urgent. Most people don't. Would you say that in Novartis that people would know where to go, or is that also a challenge?
No, I think it's a huge problem, especially in our company. We've been subjected to a number of large reorganizations globally over the last sort of 8 years or so. There seems to be something all the time going on, changes, and that's exactly the feedback I get. An example I've had in the last month or so is some Stakeholders I used to support in a previous role reached out to me and said, are you still doing anything with competitive intelligence? Because obviously I'd moved on to a different role. And I said, well, yes, I am. Okay, well, I decided to reach out to you just in case you can put me in touch, because I've got no clue who I should talk to. I know there are CI activities going on, but I do not know who's doing it. And I would say, even for me, with this large CI group that we have, oftentimes I don't know the exact person that's doing the work. And that is a problem. And it's a tricky one to overcome. Hopefully, we're going to start addressing that as we go through.
Yeah.
It is a big problem. So if you can make it as obvious as possible, and I think we probably haven't got this specifically in the slides, but it's kind of this multi-channel approach as well. Is people, deal with information different ways according to personal preference. Some are very visual, some want to be pushed information all the time, some are very proactive at going to get it, some prefer emails, some prefer RSS feeds, some prefer going to a portal and logging on and looking. Everyone's got different ways of wanting to access and interact with that information. And so that's something I think you also have to factor in as you go along as part of the technological solution.
Yeah, we'll get closer to that one in a few slides, I guess. So we let's look at the next one here. This is wonderful, right? Because we see them everywhere. But Andrew, go through them from your perspective and see what what you have. Yeah.
I'm sure most of us have said something like this at some point to someone at work. I certainly have. The top, you've got this idea from the management. Well, why would we need to change? Because I'm so perfectly happy with the analysts I've got in my group. They're doing a fantastic job. No need to change. It's fine. Others are kind of, well, I kind of heard about it. It's a bit wishy-washy, but I can't see how that would be useful to my job. Again, this is like the minimum effort approach, I like to call it. Then we've addressed the one in the top right, this whole, well, I think I've got something. I have no clue who to speak to, or maybe what I've got in mind is not that relevant. So I'm a bit hesitant to share. And the more management approach again is, it's not my job to spend time on someone else's problem, and again, my manager is not going to like that. And I think that's a real critical problem with our current setup, is the way that line management and reward and recognition would work. Then you've got people who maybe don't necessarily understand the technology or the roles of CI analysts and what value we can add above just getting an alert from Google or an RSS feed. Again, there's an education piece required here. And then this feeling of people aren't interested in what I've got to say. And it's often not the case. They've often got a lot of information that will be incredibly interesting to others to add on top of what's already known. And then, the other two barrier comments are always, well, no, I don't know how to use that tool, so I'm not going to. I'm resistant to change. Yeah, and that's the way we've always worked. There's just, that's how it is. I don't see a reason for changing, because everyone is in their own little silo, perfectly happy with how it's working for them personally, and no point in changing. But for me, the role I now have, again, I'm dealing with things that tend to go across the portfolio. There's a huge need for change from my perspective, because I need the inputs from many different groups, and we've got to make sure that we're all speaking the same language and we have one source of truth.
Yeah. I mean, one thing that you can reflect on when you see all this is that you may start thinking about a massive sort of or mass training. I wouldn't say massive, but mass training on what intelligence operations actually are in a large company, such as just short video sessions or something. Big question is, would that work? Comes down to the communication platforms in each company, of course. But Would you say, Andrew, would something like that work in Novartis, or would it sort of be just another thing on the
it would, but I think again you couldn't get away with just one video, share it with the whole organization. It's in some way has to be tailored or customized to individual groups to really sort of display the benefits from a different way of working. And so it's not as simple to just say, right, post this on our intranet, really cool, funky video with a super cool, media company has produced this shiny video for us. It can help, it can build some of the awareness, but again, I don't think you quite tap in to the brain of the individuals involved thinking, no, yeah, I get this. We absolutely need to do that. I think you've got to do a little bit more to really reach that kind of audience. And so that would be
I agree.
That's why it's so tricky.
Yeah. No, I mean it's a challenge. Getting just the knowledge about these operations out in an organization so people get aware of it. We've identified 4 areas of breaking down the knowledge silos. We're going to go through them one by one. But Andrew, would you like to quickly comment on the overall? Yeah.
Again, we're going away from the original paper that Gabriel wrote now. This was sort of the avenue I sort of went down when I was thinking about how things were in Novartis. So you can kind of break this down. So recognizing what the critical knowledge might be, making access to that information as easy as possible, establishing community of practice, and then find some sort of way of incentivizing this new approach to knowledge sharing. So I think I'm going to let Gabriel talk about the first one. He's really a true expert.
I'll take that on his second. But first, just a reflection. I read an article quite some time ago about, we're talking about sharing cultures, incentivized knowledge sharing. That was about asking cultures. And I found that really interesting, because essentially it said we can share as much as we like, but unless we learn how to ask our colleagues, and particularly people that I might not know that well, we're not really going to get this sort of valuable sharing feeds in operation. Do you have an asking culture in Novartis? Do you reach out to colleagues?
That's a tricky one, and I think a lot comes down to individual personalities, or you're introvert or extrovert. I'd say certainly the most of the people I'm interacting with, my stakeholders, tend to be the more senior leaders these days, and they're not at all afraid of asking questions. And often they can ask too many questions, to be honest. But when you sort of go down the pyramid a little bit to more of the knowledge workers, the analysts that maybe don't have that leadership or the visibility, it's certainly an experience that they're really not well prepared generally to ask questions. Again, some of those sort of speech bubbles we had in the previous couple of slides ago around, I'm not 100% on this. I'm not sure I can really raise this question or raise this point. It's a difficult one to try and reach. But again, I think if you're able to build knowledge and build experience and build the network, as we'll see, you become much more comfortable in that environment. And when you're more comfortable, you're more able to talk and answer those questions.
Thank you. So let's jump into these 4 areas then. The first one, to identify, document critical knowledge. The key thing here, as it says, the best approach to bridge knowledge silos are intentional and targeted. We need to know what we're looking for, and we need to identify where that critical knowledge resides, and to capture and make that broadly available. This includes people. We'll come back to that. But very often, we say that knowledge, that's documented knowledge, is in paperwork. But it also actually means identify people who can help in sort of understanding what it is that I need to understand. And also, we're talking about the analysis models and processes deployed in the different corners of an organization. Analysis models often are seen as something rather complex. I very often advocate when I do consulting in this, that don't go for the super complex, enormously sort of tedious analysis models that takes months to produce a report. Go for the simple ones. The important part with analysis models is really to have a common language within which we can undertake our analysis, so everyone understands what comes out of it. So simplicity is actually something that could steer your strategy when it comes to those areas. And also, the last one here, the key point, avoid too much sharing. That's a little bit back to my question about the asking culture, because sharing, people are happily putting, a long list of recipients on BCC in emails. That will eventually not work. I'm also very critical to many newsletters that you will find in larger organizations. People just write newsletters and send them out. You're lucky if one piece of news every fourth newspaper is actually fit for purpose for every recipient of that newspaper. So or the newsletter, it has to be more sort of targeted, and that's why this whole thing about identify what is critical and document that so people can find a way in it. I think this is absolutely crucial when setting up something like this.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of really, really valuable watch outs here as well, because I think I've seen it from both sides where someone feels they're doing a good job because they are sending out more alerts than anyone else. And then if you were to actually ask the stakeholders, the people that are receiving them, it's like, this is just nonsense, or it's too much, and I don't care. So you can easily have people switching off very, very quickly if you do that. So you've got to know what to share, where and when.
If you tell people that they're spamming their colleagues, they typically don't get very happy, but sometimes that's actually the truth.
Exactly. And it's also, again, trying to cut out the noise. I think it's really important that as part of documenting what the critical knowledge is, there is an agreement there. You don't need, for example, I don't know, launch strategy in Mexico and share that broadly across the country. It's not relevant to 90% of the people, 99% of the people. So that's really, really important. Is you understand where the efficiencies are to be had.
Actually, that brings us to the next, so you can just continue here. Rather than sharing, making access easy so people actually can find what they find relevant. So Andrew, take this.
So there's a lot to be said here, and it's easily overlooked, I think, is you streamline the access as best you can, and that means avoiding requesting permissions or access rights, or having to fill in forms or get managers sign off and all that sort of stuff to try and access this. They simply won't bother, and that's even been my feedback to external syndicated database vendors in the past that I've worked with. I offer a lot of my sort of feedback to their products. If it takes 3 mouse clicks to get to something when it could just be one, then I get annoyed very quickly. Now, that doesn't sound very much of a problem, but if I need to click 3 times many times a day, that soon adds up. I don't want to have to do that. That's just a small example, sort of going off left field a bit. But if you're able to invest in enterprise solutions, and that includes a good search engine and implement processes that you can sort of put in a more centralized system, so people with different backgrounds, different needs and requirements can all access effectively customized information and interact with what they want to interact with, all the better.
Andrew, I have to jump in with a question here. It's that of IT departments, because this is something that us in the intelligence community very much like this to happen. But when you go to your IT department and say, "Oh, I'd like general access to everything, please," they would think that you're out of some sort of institution somewhere. So how does this work in Novartis? Is there an open sort of access policy to some extent, or how do you deal with that?
It is a difficult one, and I think in recent years it's become an awful lot better, an awful lot easier. Things like single sign-on with various syndicated databases, and the computer systems know who it is trying to access. It's very quick to immediately let them in or say no, you don't have permission. So I think we've come an awful long way with IT and IT security and firewalls, that sort of thing. certainly in the pharma industry, we tend to be very, very ultra conservative and protective about our information. But I think that's certainly loosened over recent years, with the move to things like cloud computing and, all of our data being hosted in the Amazon cloud somewhere. There has to have been technology solutions that they've had to find for the way that the business is working. So it's actually, I'd say, got an awful lot easier for people to be able to sort of access that from a technology standpoint. It's less of a problem. But again, I think what's really important to say is, again, back to that idea of, can they find it? Do they know where to go to get it? Is it obvious? Because again, we're discovering on a daily basis that how come these project managers I'm working with don't have access or aren't aware of this really obvious tool that I use on a daily basis, because it's often not well communicated.
It brings us. I think we are just we're about the time. To some extent, that brings us to the next slide. Can we jump on there?
Please, let's get going.
We'll see. Because this sort of ties into that, to some extent, access that we need to establish a community of practice. And just for those of you who might not know exactly what we mean, it's a definition of a cross-functional network of people that sort of help members share and learn from one another within their experiences. They can absolutely come from different disciplines, as long as you have sort of the cross relevance in working together. And it's also, to say, a great way to fill gaps in documented knowledge. So if you don't have the access, so you don't know where to go, if you have a community of practice where you can reach out to people you do know, that can speed up, the insight seeking, the insights gathering tremendously, compared to being the one that has to sit there and do the searches and browse through various parts of your intranet or shared facilities. So the whole thing about finding an expert, this is, as you can see, coming back a little bit to the lone wolves, because they were the experts. If we can start engaging our lone wolves within these kinds of communities of practices, we really start getting into a situation where we're making use of their knowledge, and we're also helping them to get more interaction with other experts within the organization. So providing ways for employees to ask questions, to request help, facilitates these conversations, and it really mentors and coaches across different parts of the business. So the whole thing about community of practice, I would say, is one of the key tools that can be deployed in order to break down the silo problems that we're discussing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the key part here, I think Gabriel mentioned, was, the face-to-face nature. We're all very happy to sit on Zoom calls and things these days, but face-to-face is really, really important to get everyone in a room together if you can. Maybe I'm talking about competitive intelligence, community of practice meetings that we run. It's the easiest and quickest way to get the buy-in from all these different experts and people involved, to see that they are part of the solution and motivate them to sort of say, actually, I can see how I can have a much better role in this if I buy into it. It's probably the most powerful tool we can use to try and effect the change.
And bringing up that face-to-face, I would, with the teams I've been working with, I would say it's even critical that you at least once meet face-to-face, even if you're from different parts of the world. Because in communities of practice, you also have to have a sort of culture in which you can discuss anything, even things that might not be entirely convenient if, let's say, senior management would hear it, because you need to be able to question strategies and tactics that is already decided, if things so-called to be done. So and you typically don't do that unless you trust the people you work with, and in my experience, trust is built much more if you really meet, chat, and work together physically, and then of course you can rely on online conversations. So that's the true key.
Shall I interrupt with some questions?
Yeah.
Please.
Fantastic. Well, actually, I'm going to invite the people who put the questions to unmute and ask them. I thought it would be easier. Denise, you've got an interesting question about developing COPs and enterprise tools. Do you want to ask Gabriel and Andrew?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, I just wondered how much an enterprise-wide kind of CI tool can help with kind of exchange and also help with sort of enabling communities of practice. I mean, I understand the significance of being able to meet face to face, but you do also need some way to share materials afterwards.
Yep. If you ask me, it's not how much it can help. It's an absolute necessity, because unless you have some sort of dedicated tool for in this case the CI community, but any sort of community of practice, where to deal with the results, where to continue your dialogues in a structured way. This actually goes back to that the slide where you said you have to identify the critical knowledge and document areas, because those are the areas within which you want to keep developing your capabilities and your resources, and that has to be documented and being possible to work with somewhere, and that should be in such a system. So that's my response.
Yeah, and my thought as well. I agree completely, Denise. And you're also, with an enterprise type tool, you're reaching all of your stakeholders as well. And what you hopefully can streamline towards is more one source of truth. So all these different groups are, using the same sets of data and information. There is a consensus opinion. There is a feedback loop. I don't think we're talking too much today about that. But that's a critical component as well of, reaching out to your end users and getting some of their feedback, even if it's pointing out an error you might have made. That the tool goes hand in hand with the people and with the community of practice. Absolutely.
Thank you.
We've also got a couple of questions from Bertha. Bertha, do you want to mute and ask those while we've got Gabriel and Andrew paused?
Hi, thank you. Yes, one is about if you have any kind of sort of handbook or interesting book about how CI on healthcare. I work in healthcare for the NHS, and I think even like the pharmaceutical can be similar, but not. So that's one. And the other one is, I wonder if you know of any organization who can be taken as an example of CI, because I think we all acknowledge that there are problems with that, but I wonder if there has been an organization that can be a good example. Thank you.
Andrew, you want to take the first one? You're closer than I am on that one.
Probably am not, actually. I can't really think of there being an obvious handbook other than suggesting you Google it, because I think the way that CI operations would work in every individual company is likely to be different. And something I've discovered on my journey here is you can write a guidance document, a handbook, a CI Bible, if you like, and it will be out of date by the time you finish it. Probably once you're halfway through creating it, it'll be out of date. But I would maybe recommend, there's an awful lot of CI content available through Skip, and also those papers by the likes of Leonard Fuld, Ben Gillard, the sort of the forefathers of competitive intelligence as well. There's plenty of books out there about CI as a whole, and I think you can probably apply what you read there, understanding your role or your industry, and see how it would work.
I don't think I can add anything to that when it comes to the specifics of healthcare. Me and my former partner of COMINTELLI made an attempt a few years ago, so we wrote a book about the general setup of tech for as intelligence support in an organization. Could be worthwhile just having a look at that one, because it's sort of generic. It's not particularly for any type of operation. But other than that, I don't have any sort of insights into that now.
I think it's very difficult with an organization like the NHS, unless, again, something we didn't quite mention, but if you've got top-down support for any of this, that's going to be the kicker. That's the thing that would make the greatest difference, really, is you kind of need someone at that top level to say, hey, this is what we need to make sure we can try and sort of get rid of some of the barriers that would be in place naturally with a sort of siloed organization.
I think we shall continue, and then we'll keep up with some more questions afterwards. We have a few more slides. The fourth of the sort of breaking down the silos slide is this one, where we say incentivize knowledge sharing. And before Andrew sort of takes off and talks a little bit about the Novartis specifics, I just want to raise a word of warning when it comes to incentivizing knowledge sharing, because I've seen the flip side of that coin too many times, and that is when you start rewarding people monetary or monetary like types of awards for instance, posting the largest number of insights on the intranet, giving the most speeches, etc., etc., etc. It's very, very often a situation that you find when you start digging into those volumes of information that they're not all that relevant. So try to avoid that type of incentives. Then I know that Andrew has some other examples. So off you go.
Yeah, and so there's kind of two aspects here. And again, one thing hopefully I've sort of emphasized is, although we're trying to do something at an enterprise scale across the company and across groups, to get that buy-in, you've kind of almost got to customize that approach to the individuals and the groups that would be involved. And that includes, different cultures, different geographies, different backgrounds, all react in different ways to any given incentive, maybe even monetary reward. So to give you an idea, we've got a large group in India, and something that they love getting the recognition and having their sort of their name on the wall, or a PDF certificate to print out and put on their desk to say, hey, great job, kind of employee of the month type thing. There's a sort of like points awards that we might have in our company, and it's not necessarily about a financial reward. It's a visibility award. But to someone old, a dinosaur like me, someone giving me a PDF to print out to stick on a desk that's non-existent at work anymore, there's no point. Show me the money, or write a really nice article and have the CEO comment on it would be good. So you've got to be aware, again, getting to know the people, the personalities, coming back to that face-to-face part of your community, to know what makes people tick and to try and tap into that. Really, really important. Other important part is not to try and put different groups within your organization into competition head to head, like challenging, ranking them in performance terms, or giving out bonuses to one and not to others. That doesn't work, because it disincentivizes those that aren't being rewarded. And again, if you can get that acknowledgement from the top down and really visualize that success story, that's really, really, really powerful.
Yeah.
We get asked sometimes about return on investment for CI, and can you prove a monetary value to it? Because again, there's a good story behind it, and it is very tricky, especially in my role when we're looking at research and development. We don't have anything to sell. We're just trying to create that next generation of drugs, but we're not gaining any money. We're a cost to the organization. So that top down visibility works wonders.
I think my experience as well is that if there's one incentive that I've seen sort of surpass anyone else, is that when someone's output or input to the CI is recognized and also used maybe by senior executives in their public presentations and stuff like that. I've seen that a few times, and I mean that nothing beats that. Obviously, you can't do that just as a planned reward, but when it happens, it can spur the entire team tremendously. Yeah.
Brilliant.
So 3 slides here. Andrew, you're going to talk about them too. You think you can sort of go through these slides in like 5 or 6 minutes?
We're going to get away from the knowledge silos a minute and try and sort of extol the benefits of this enterprise mindset that we've been talking about. And hopefully through the course of this presentation, you're kind of getting to see where we're coming from. And this idea, this missing value piece really is by everyone in your community or in your organization having this shared context and having some shared goals but also taking into account everyone's different viewpoint and background to kind of come up with a consensus opinion that is agreed upon. It's really, really important that you're understanding where other people are coming from, others, opinions on the information you present, the way that you look at information in a different way. Bearing in mind, you've got these experts with a very unique context and a unique view, used to supporting their own stakeholders, but they've probably got a strong opinion on that overall information being used elsewhere in the organization. And this is where the value really is coming from at that top level, is it's shared and it all has a purpose, and we're all able in some way to relate to this. And I think being able to relate to something is really the key piece. There's a, if you can read your company's communications across, all employees, often it won't really resonate because it just doesn't involve you. It doesn't interest you. But if you've got something to say that you can relate to, you're going to buy into it, and you can see the additional value to that. And so what we did on the next slide, we're trying to really explain, again, this is maybe a Novartis perspective, that how you can provide greater value to the organization at that top level. All of your data, if you're all working in the same sort of way, means it all becomes comparable. So you can do benchmarking and trend analyses, that sort of thing. And if you're following common structures, taxonomies, the same models and the same processes, again, everything becomes far more efficient and manageable. You've got a greater consistency, a uniform consistency across everything. And then that really, really influences making the right decisions. And again, I think this is the way that I've been framing it to our group, is if we can provide really accurate information with some insight and value, you can be confident that the decision is going to be made on good, trustworthy information and not on false information. Acting on the wrong information usually results in a terrible decision. Then you've got the predictability. And certainly in the pharma industry, we need to have that predictability and be forward looking. We don't like being taken by surprise at all. And for that, you need some kind of institutionalized memory, understand what's happened before, and sharing those experiences and having that consensus view, as we'd said, on things that we've seen or things that might play out. Because if you don't have that, you can't predict the future. You can't come up with what Gabriel terms the joint map of the expected if you don't know what the expected would be. And that's where finding anomalies or unexpected pieces of information can really make a difference, because you're going to be able to spot them. And it also, that can pop up from anywhere. It can be just from, a regular news feed, and just something will jump out at you based on your experience. But you also now know where you can share your expertise on this and offer your opinion to someone that maybe is in more of a decision-making capacity. So there we go. If you're all lone wolves, you're not doing this, you're not working together, it's very, very difficult to make that happen. And the conclusion for the organization is with this streamlined enterprise approach, the sum is way greater than the sum of the parts.
And to conclude that on the final slide before going to the wrap up, the shared context also benefits our lone wolves, right?
Exactly. So it's coming back again. You've got to incentivize it. What's in it for me personally? So if you are one of these lone wolves, what happens is all of your knowledge and expertise, it can be leveraged to a much greater extent. With that comes a broader network for you to operate in. So you're not just this subject matter expert to neuroscience R&D, you're the neuroscience CI expert across all matters. I think from the CI perspective, you kind of have a different toolbox to most, and you've got access to more different information sources, and maybe take a different approach to understanding what any kind of landscape or strategy might look like. And so you can add a huge amount of capability and bring a greater awareness to your organization because of this different toolbox. And again, Gabriel spoke kind of before about this, that and I've lost my train of thought just babbling on a minute. Sorry about that. But you can have a much greater effect really, because you're offering something that they won't have heard before, and hopefully you're now at that point where you're able to have that asking culture and ask the key questions. You don't need to know the answer, but you have to be able to ask the question. And then you hopefully, as all part of this, you've built your people network, your community. It can lead to greater career opportunities, personal development opportunities, because you've got a greater visibility across the organization. So there's a few key points there why it's great for every individual to work in this way. And as we're doing this, we're building all the base skills, all of our knowledge, and starting knocking down those barriers and the resistance to change that we see. And the outcome really is something with much greater value, because really what we're talking about at the end of the day is working far more effectively and far more efficiently.
And that kind of concludes the actual presentation. We just wanted to say a few words about where to start. And I think Andrew and I agree on that. It's not so much a question of where to start, but to start, maybe do something. But it's also worthwhile just mentioning those three areas out on the right here that you see: the information technology and people. These are the three areas of resources, capability building, that you need to consider in the context of intelligence. And one word of advice when trying to take the next step in an intelligence operations development is to try to figure out which one of these are the weakest. Because you can have super people and tons of information, but without a technology supporting that, the people can utilize that information in a structured and valuable way, it's not really a good idea to start getting more information in or developing the people skills, because you need then to invest in technology. And you would have exactly the same balance if you have super technology and tons of information and the people that you're working with simply don't know how to use this. So then you have to work more in developing the communities and the people skills in working with tech and information. So these three resource areas needs to be in balance. But with that caveat, I think the real sort of message is start doing something somewhere, and gradually it will evolve.
So Gabriel, I was going to throw you a curveball. I know we're at time and I apologize, but what if you identify equal deficiencies in the technology, in the information, and in the people? Where might you start with your experience?
If they're all equally weak, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah. Yes.
Okay, this might sound like I'm biased, but I would start looking in the technology field. I wouldn't do a big bang in the technology field, but the thing is that if you essentially, I would start with technology, then look at the information, and then the people. Because when you start developing the organization, they will be expecting to find something. They will be expecting to have something given to them that will improve their efficiency. And without some technology and some information strategies in place, the risk is that when you start working with individuals, that is sort of, it falls flat, because you've said that we're going to develop this resource, but there are no resources to work with. So I would say that's probably the priority I would take. First, technology, just so I know that I have somewhere to put the information, secure the information, and then start working with the people skills.
Great, thanks.
Okay, final slide, the take-home message.
Yeah, exactly as you'd said, Gabriel. Don't wait for others. If you're inspired by what you've heard, if you kind of already see how that can be a greater value to you, just start slight modifications to the way you work, get yourself out there, share more information, and people will start to come along for the ride. If you start displaying best practices, start talking about the tools and the processes you're using when no one else is, again, you'll start standing out and people will start taking notice. You will get noticed. And the ultimate for me is you're going to have to be persistent. This is not an easy thing to do. We have not cracked it. We've been, we've scratched the surface. We know where we want to go, but it's a long road. It's difficult, but you can make a difference just by starting and being a little bit more persistent.
And on the persistency, what I would say also, you have to realize that this is not a project. It's a type of operation you launch, and then it has to be managed over time. I mean, it doesn't happen by itself. So communities needs to be managed, information and technology platforms need to be managed, and they need support. So it is a sort of a matrix type of organization where you need to run the community on an ongoing basis. So it's not just a project where you develop it and then you leave it and hope for it to work on its own. I think that's it. And here's just a final piece of ad, I guess, on the book and that paper that was written in the early days on this, in the early days of this year. But Helen, are there any other questions?
Well, there is a comment that the Gardens of Intelligence is very good to read. So there we go.
Thank you very
I don't know
much.
if you paid someone to say that, but there we go.
Thank you.
There was one last question. I hope people don't mind us going over, but it's an interesting one. Sarah Le Breton, do you want to unmute, or I can just say it if you want to? You might have
Sorry,
gone.
trying to find the mute button. Yeah, it was just basically, how do you incentivize? I liked all your points about incentivizing knowledge sharing, but I was just wondering, I suppose, back to some of the points that were made earlier, how do you incentivize people actually using the knowledge and basically increasing the demand and that asking culture that you talked about?
When it comes to the usage of it, this might be a defensive answer, but my experience is that when you actually make it easily and readily available to people in a way that they find it, so it's sort of you take away the hurdles of finding things that are relevant to them. That's typically an incentive to use it, because if they want it, it's definitely something that will help them do their jobs better, and then they will utilize it. So I think it's more of the access issues we discussed before, which is a huge one. It's not just opening up that I can access the shared folders. It's as and Andrew mentioned, the taxonomies, the browsing structures. How can I make it as easy as possible for every single individual based on their respective mandates to access and find what they need? I think that's more of the key challenge than incentivizing in terms of a real incentive. I don't know if that answers your question, but
it is a great question. So my perspective would be, I think there's already a desire from, say, your stakeholders to get access to this information, to have the best possible information and insights they can possibly get their hands on. So if you're able to provide that, again, the what's in it for me from their side would be, I can trust this data, so I don't have to spend extra time working on it, getting it into shape, being confident that it's right. I can spend my time adding the value piece and thinking about the decision making. So I don't think, certainly with the senior people I'm working with, that there's already that desire to have it. They recognize there's a gap in trying to access the best quality information at that sort of enterprise level. So they don't really need the incentive, because they already know that if someone else can provide it for them, they don't have to do it. That's the biggest incentive of all, is let someone else do it.
I can actually add to that. We worked with the corporate management team once, and essentially asked each member of that team, what do you need? And then we personalized it. I mean, we completely dissed all the newsletters and stuff like that, because they were far too wide, and that actually worked.
That's interesting, thank you. Yeah, I suppose where I was coming from is maybe there's just a little bit of a change of behaviour, and I made a comment earlier in the chat actually that I think sometimes as well people like to be coming up with their own ideas. They like to be seen as the person who is doing new stuff.
Okay, so like, okay, yeah, but I mean,
so reusing is not necessarily.
No, I can see where you're coming from, but then also, if you can see the reuse as incentives to come up with something even further new.
Yes.
The other way to look at it as
synthesize it. Yeah.
You know, other way of looking at it, if you can leverage what someone else has done and add a little extra spin, you can take that to your siloed stakeholders and say, I've got all of this. Trust me, you're going to be well recognized for that. And you've barely added anything. It's like, oh, look, that's useful. I can see how that benefits my stakeholders. But they probably haven't accessed it or seen it yet. I'm the one that's going to get the visibility from my individual stakeholders. So I think that works very well. Again, there's the efficiency, and someone else has done it for me, and I'm going to take all the credit in my own little world. Maybe not at that corporate level, but with all your saying neuroscience stakeholders, it's going to be, wow, look what Andrew just did. That's really fantastic. And really, it was Raj in the background that had done it for someone else. And I'm just leveraging that capability and adding a spin to my own stakeholders.
Thank you. That's really interesting. Thank you.
Brilliant. I think we have gone over time, but I just wanted to say thank you so much to Gabriel and Andrew for this session. It's been really, really interesting.
Thank you very much.
Thanks to everyone who came along and for asking really interesting questions, because it is always so useful to hear from people who are doing this work and find out what their challenges are, because, you know, everyone has very, very similar challenges. It's always so interesting to us. So don't forget that the link for the recording will be coming out later this week. That's going to be available via Gabriel's YouTube channel. And also don't forget the other webinar that the group is organising next week. I had put a link in the chat if you can find that. Otherwise, if you search for my name on Eventbrite, you should be able to find it. And lastly, a quick plea for the CILIP members and people who are members of our special interest group. We are not allowed to sign you up to our newsletter. You have to do that yourself because of data protection reasons. So, you know, please, if you're not getting the newsletter, go back to the sort of CILIP main page and make sure you're signed up to our newsletter, because that's a great way to find out what we're doing, or join the LinkedIn group. Fantastic. And I think that's about it from me. Thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Gabriel and Andrew, for that really interesting presentation.
Thank you very much.
See some of you next week. Cheers.
Thanks a lot, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.